The birth of the modern world, otherwise known as the Scientific Revolution and the Enlightenment. We'll start off with the Scientific Revolution. Really, when somebody speaks of the Scientific Revolution, you're thinking about a major rejection of traditional authority, most signified by that of the Catholic Church. The Scientific Revolution had a lot to do with the direct observation of nature, meaning seeking proof in natural phenomenon rather than taking a priest or the Pope's word for it. This was really accomplished through the utilization of the scientific method. One way of putting it is educated guesses, but another way, probably a more accurate way, would be the using a specific method to eliminate biases and to arrive at correct answers about the natural world, including experimentation, observation, analyses of findings, and then comparisons to other scientists' answers to see how accurate they are. Observation and scientific method were used for any number of different things during the period, which is really chronologically the 1500s. Everything from why the sky is blue to why the moon changes shape was studied via the scientific method. Again, testing hypotheses through experiments. One person who was extrememely important in this way was Copernicus and his heliocentric model of the universe. Helio meaning helium, which refers to the sun. Centric meaning center or middle. In this case, Copernicus's work centered around the actual location of the sun relative to the Earth. A lot of his findings went counter to that of established authority figures, particularly church authority figures, who believed that if God exists, God would, of course, put the Earth in the middle of the solar system. This theory was known as the geocentric model. However, Copernicus' findings, through the use of his scientific instrumentation, led him to the understanding and the theory that, in fact, the sun is the center of the solar system. Largely credited as the beginner or the progenitor of the scientific method is Francis Bacon, along with Galileo Galilei. Again, these are early physicists interested in the movement of heavenly bodies, and ultimately the major contributor to theories related to modern physics would be Sir Isaac Newton. His book Principia Mathematica connected the speed of falling objects to the movement of planets. This led to the theory of gravity. The old tale of being hit in the head with the apple as he sat under a tree may or may not have happened. Probably didn't happen, but what is not debatable is that Newton's impact on the way human beings view themselves relative to the rest of the world that they live in. Yeah, and ultimately, the major impact of the scientific revolution was that human beings learned or came to understand that the universe and the world that we live in acts according to fixed and fundamental laws, meaning that there are certain things that can be understood and that act upon the world and the universe. Ultimately here, the scientific revolution was an extremely optimistic time, a time where human beings began to understand that they can understand the universe that they live in. All they had to do was to apply observation, experimentation, and mathematics to their work, and perhaps the mysteries of living be unlocked. And the truths about the scientific revolution, the idea of optimism and understanding the world that we live in, follows through to another period, and in a lot of ways it was actually going on at the same time. This I'm referring to as the Enlightenment. Again, it was a time of optimism, but for a different reason, whereas the scientific revolution was really about understanding natural phenomena and the natural world that we live in. The Enlightenment was really all about the political, economic, and social world that we live in. Government, money, social structures, how we relate to one another, and how we are governed. All of these were ideas explored during the Enlightenment. First and foremost, this idea of reason or logic. European philosophers really believed that governments of the world should be reflective of the human logic or human reason and not arbitrary laws or arbitrary will, most commonly referred to as the arbitrary law of kings, meaning they make it up. Enlightenment philosophers really believed that the government should be a reflection of certain rules or certain laws, similar to the way the scientific revolution thinkers believed the universe was in reality a reflection of certain laws or rules. Specifically, the Enlightenment philosophers referred to those rules or laws as natural law. Natural law is really an idea that goes back to ancient Greece, as do a lot of these ideas, just as the scientific method was in some ways practiced by thinkers like Aristotle. Natural law, it was an idea that goes back to antiquity as well. It's really a view that there is a higher law to which specific written laws of a government must be compared, and that it's universal. And that's probably the most important part of the whole idea of natural law, is that throughout the world, whatever time, whatever place, whatever region or country that you live in, laws that are made by governments of men need to be reflective of certain realities. And different Enlightenment thinkers and philosophers have different ideas about what those proper laws should be. But because we're really following right now, the European ideas related to that, we're going to focus on philosophers who tend to believe things like life, liberty, property, equality, things of those nature are those universal laws that must be applied. Okay, so the first of our Enlightenment philosophers that we're going to be discussing here is John Locke, 1632 to 1704. That was his lifespan. Unlike the others, the other philosophers we'll discuss, Locke was actually an Englishman. Really most famous for his kind of slogan here, life, liberty, and property being natural rights, meaning that all governments have certain solemn responsibilities to protect the person's right to live, certain freedoms that they have, and their right to really possess property or own property. These were natural rights and the things that governments are most responsible to protect. He also believed in this concept of a social contract, and it's not up here on the slide, but that second bullet point there, Locke believed people gave up total freedom for the protection of a ruler. That's sort of the exchange, that's sort of the agreement. People in society, they give up all of their complete freedom to do anything they want in exchange for a kind of security that they receive from the ruler or the government. And this was important to Locke and in his writing, and really this last concept here, that if the ruler fails to protect the people, men have a responsibility to overthrow the government. Really, that's going to form sort of the intellectual basis behind a lot of the 18th and 19th century revolutions that we're going to talk about later on. Particularly the American Revolution and the French Revolution in the sort of the latter half of the 18th century. This whole idea that if kings and governments were taking advantage of their powers and sort of forgetting about their solemn responsibilities to protect life, liberty, and property, then that government should be overthrown. Locke's book, Two Treatises on Government, really goes into these ideas, and they're going to be followed by other thinkers. Other thinkers like Thomas Jefferson in particular are going to read Locke's books and then sort of base their own ideas and their own revolutions on the ideas in Locke's books. Another philosopher, this Baron Montesquieu, 1689 to 1755, another thinker very interested in the way governments work, and sort of in a spirit very similar to the scientific revolution, how thinkers like Copernicus and Galileo were interested in how the natural world really works. Montesquieu was extremely interested in how the political world really works and how power is really given and where it really comes from and how governments exercise that power. What Montesquieu actually did was he looked at history and he looked at rulers throughout history, and he really came to the conclusion that they all do three things. They make laws, they judge laws, and they carry out laws. All governments do that. But he also believed that the root of all corruption in government came from too few people having power to do all three of those things. You could become corrupt if you're the judge, jury, and executioner, so to speak. So Montesquieu's idea in the book Spirit of Laws was to separate those powers, give one person or group of people the right to make a law, give one person or group of people the right to carry out the law, and then give another person or group of people the right to judge whether or not those laws are fair. This way, you're preventing any one group or individual from becoming too powerful, becoming a king. These philosophers, Locke, Montesquieu, later we'll talk about Voltaire and Rousseau, they all had a fear of corruption in government and from a governmental leader, particularly a king, becoming too powerful. And all their ideas are really designed to prevent a leader from becoming too powerful. So, here's Voltaire, another French guy, 1694 to 1778. You can see all of these individuals lived right around between the 17th and the 18th centuries, which is the 16th and 1700s. It'll be their work that later thinkers form political revolutions on, particularly the end of the 18th century or the end of the 1700s, going into the 1800s. So Voltaire was a Frenchman who actually had a lot of admiration for the English system, which was a constitutional monarchy, a king bound by parliament, a king who had to rule sort of in conjunction with a sort of semi-elected body of individuals. And Voltaire, it's again not on the slide here, but he had a major problem with religion being involved in government. He believed that God or the Catholic Church in particular had no place in determining laws for people here on earth. Today we kind of refer to this concept as the separation of church and state. So you can kind of see a lot of the ideas that our system is based upon today come from these thinkers. Separation of powers with Montesquieu, separation of church and state with Voltaire, and also this idea of a central leader who has to sort of cooperate with another body, particularly and preferably an elected body, this idea of a monarchy bound by a constitution, and civil rights. So a lot of the things that we take for granted in our system really come from what these Enlightenment thinkers were talking about in the 17 and 1800s. And here's Rousseau. Rousseau, very interesting. He's the youngest of these people, 1712 to 1778. Also one of the most radical Enlightenment thinkers. And in this case, the political term radical refers to really having ideas that are furthest from the mainstream, meaning Rousseau really wanted change, and he wanted it to happen quickly, and if necessary, even violently. And he wrote a book, The Social Contract, and I referred to the social contract earlier with John Locke. Rousseau also believed that citizens sort of exchange certain freedoms in exchange for security and protection from a government. Only Rousseau's idea here, this concept of the collective will, this was very, very important to Rousseau. This idea that governments need to truly reflect what the majority of the people want, and actually act in accordance, direct accordance with what the majority of people want. The reason we talk about these individuals, Rousseau, Locke, Montesquieu, Voltaire, is because they had a major impact on the history that followed them. See here, the Enlightenment is the foundation for representative government. These individuals lived just before the American Revolution. Some of them even lived during parts of the American Revolution, and it was their writing that is going to have a major impact on the founding fathers of the United States. People like Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, John Hancock, and even George Washington, and John Adams to some extent. Their writing is going to have a major impact on how they think and what they think government is there to do. Government is there to look after the rights of the people and to protect certain natural rights of the people, namely life, liberty, and property. And it's an interesting thing, actually. If you look at the Declaration of Independence, which was written by Thomas Jefferson, the youngest of the Founding Fathers, there's a great deal of what I'm going to go ahead and call plagiarism in the Declaration of Independence, because he sort of took what John Locke had written in his book years before, and used it, hook, line, and sinker. Instead of saying governments need to protect life, liberty, and property, he wrote governments protect life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which he and his other founding fathers sort of believed is what property was. So here we are, the French Revolution. The French Revolution is really the result of a changing of the ground rules, which had begun to occur initially during the Scientific Revolution, and then really some of these major ideas, particularly questioning of authority and looking at the roots of where power comes from, the nature of the social contract, things like that. Really, a lot of these ideas come to fruition during the Enlightenment and have a major impact on political thinkers and even some leaders during the second half of the 18th century, the end of the 1700s. The French Revolution is a earth-changing event. There's really no other way to put it, because the old expression goes, when France sneezes, the rest of Europe catches cold, meaning that France is sort of in the middle of everything in Western Europe. And when their political ideologies and ideas begin to change during the end of the 18th century, it's going to mean that it's going to affect other countries, not only even in Europe, but across the pond, so to speak, in the New World. So you're going to see here that during the French Revolution, the whole concept of divine right theory, meaning the king getting his power to rule from God, is going to come into doubt, and ideas about where power comes from and how government should use its power are all going to come under question, and really a new direction is going to occur. I'll start out with a little bit of background information here. And the end of the 1700s, France was definitely one of the most powerful nations in Western Europe. However, one of the problems with France at this time was its treasury was pretty empty. The cupboard was bare. King Louis XVI's predecessor, King Louis XV, had actually squandered quite a bit of money, particularly in lending great deals of it to those American revolutionaries in the 1770s. So France was basically broke. Even though it was still sort of the social and political capital of Europe, it was certainly experiencing economic problems. And really by 1789, some of those problems, including the economic problems, but not limited to them, are going to sort of all ball up and wind up causing France to erupt into a major political revolution. And some of those conditions that made France ready for revolution by 1789 was the ideas of the Enlightenment, the ideas spread by people like John Locke and Voltaire and Rousseau and Montesquieu. There was a great deal of inequality amongst the social classes, and France was sort of set up into what we call an estate system. The first estate meaning the clergy people, the second estate being the nobles, people born into power. And then the third estate, which was everybody else. You know, some estimates put that third estate at 97% of the population. They paid a great deal of the taxes, and they had very little political rights, which angered a lot of people, and that's going to be a big reason. And yeah, again, getting back to that bankrupt government, France had no money and had major issues in the 1780s, and that's probably the major reason why the revolution occurred in 1789, which happened to follow a very bad winter. So people were looking for answers. And here's a look at those social classes of the French Revolution. You can see it there in the pyramid. The pyramid is an important graphic here because it sort of represents the higher up you go in the estates, the fewer people there are. Okay, so the clergy people in the first estate, the most privileged class in France in 1789, didn't pay taxes, made up very few of the people. Second estate, it actually says there that they didn't pay any taxes. They paid some, but nowhere near the amount that the third estate did. And you see an important word there for the second estate. They collected feudal dues. That's something left over from the Middle Ages, meaning anybody not born into a position of privilege had to basically pay for the right to use land, even though the feudal system was really no longer in existence by the late 1700s in France. You see that third estate there, the bourgeoisie. I mean, really, what it literally translates to is people of the city, bourge, burg, city. But really what we're referring to here is the common people and everybody else. Okay, some of these were middle-class merchants, but many of them were professionals, people who had made lots of money in transatlantic trade with the New World. Make no mistake, the third estate was not, and I repeat, this is an important idea here, they were not just the poorest of the poor. They were everybody who did not happen to be a member of the first or second estate. Yet they were treated like they were the poorest of the poor, and that's going to be part of the reason for revolution. So, starting with the unfair tax system, again, this is sort of just related to the feudal system that was no longer in existence. Based on tradition, different social classes paid different tax rates. And that's going to make the people who are members of the lower estate, the third estate, extremely angry, because there's a feeling that even though most of them tend to not make as much money at whatever their occupations were, they still had to pay a tremendous amount out. And in some cases, a burdensome amount. Now, the government was bankrupt, okay? And the interesting thing here, and people often forget about this, is that King Louis XVI understood that the third estate could no longer pay solely, basically be the only estate that pays the taxes for the country. Remember, taxes pay everything from the army to the salaries of the admirals and everything else. So the taxes that were collected were important. King Louis XVI understood that tax money had to be generated from someone other than the third estate. So the king calls a meeting. It's called the Estates General, and that's basically a meeting where representatives from each estate gather together to advise the king. And the king's idea here was to ask the nobles, the second estate, to start paying more taxes. They absolutely refused. And ultimately, this is going to be the event that really kicks off the events of the revolution. So here we go. We're going to talk about the French Revolution. We're going to simplify it to some degree here because the French Revolution, in some interpretations, you could say it went on for more than 25 years. We're going to talk about the initial phases of the French Revolution in this next section. So there it is, the Estates General, which was a meeting that, like I said earlier, each of the estates would, or social classes, first, second, and third, would send representatives to meet and advise the king on important decisions. The problem was each estate only had one vote, regardless of the population. So very often what would occur is the top two estates would simply outvote the third estate on whatever they wanted. Anytime the third estate wanted some kind of a reform and the upper privileged estates did not, they could outvote them 2-1. And being that that third estate represented probably 97% of the population, what was actually occurring was 3% of the population were outvoting the vast majority. There was a great deal of unfairness there. So, what actually happens here is the third estate is going to get up and leave the Estates General. They're going to, being so angered that their ideas and the reforms that are being discussed are being simply thrown out, they're going to get up and leave. They are going to, as a group, stand up, leave the chamber, walk down the street, and actually the only building that was big enough to hold them all was a gymnasium. We would call it a tennis court, but it was really a gymnasium. And what they actually did was the representatives of the third estate are going to get together in this gymnasium, and they are going to swear a solemn oath to themselves. Okay, they promise one another. They call this the tennis court oath. And they're going to promise not to disband, not to break up, until they write a new constitution for France, a new framework of government for France. And now this was not a radical political body, meaning they didn't right away, they didn't want to kill the king or anything like that. They wanted moderate change, which means they wanted some degree of tax reform, and they wanted a say in what goes on. As a matter of fact, what many of them looked at was the English system of constitutional monarchy. They called themselves the National Assembly because they believed they were the only ones capable of speaking for the nation. They saw themselves as representatives of the 97%, and they believed that they were qualified to make those decisions for the people. So that's what they are going to go about doing. They leave the king. They basically leave the king high and dry. They leave the representatives of the other estates, and they say, basically, you're not qualified to speak for everybody else, whereas we are. We are the government. We are the nation, the National Assembly. So, while all of the debating was going on inside of the tennis court and the Third Estate was proclaiming itself the new National Assembly, the common people out in the city of Paris began rioting. Essentially what had happened was they heard there was some kind of political event going on, and the desperate people, the people who were desperate for any kind of change, any kind of reform, begin really going crazy. They run around, they raid the homes of nobles, they steal, in many cases they kill, and they basically go berserk. Much of their anger is sort of centered on a building. This building, which was really a political prison called the Bastille. And you can kind of see in the picture, it sort of looks a bit like a medieval castle, and many of the people in Paris sort of regard the Bastille as a leftover of an earlier time, and sort of a symbol for everything that's wrong with France, how backwards it had become, how antiquated, how outdated the political system was. So they storm it. They raid the prison. They kill the guards. They release many of the prisoners on July the 14th, 1789. And Bastille Day, as it comes to be known, sort of is the equivalent of the French 4th of July or Independence Day, because this was the event that really signified that a major, profound change was going on in France. Now, it's an important thing to remember that the people in writing the Constitution, the members of the National Assembly, were not the same as the kinds of people that were raiding the Bastille. As I said earlier, the National Assembly sort of regarded itself as a moderate group, meaning they wanted some degree of political change. They didn't want a sweeping overhaul of the system. They did not want to do away with the king. They did not want to do away with every aspect of how government took place in France. But they did want to ease their tax burden a little bit. They did want to give themselves more of a say in government. But as the fighting breaks out throughout France, as these events are occurring, the National Assembly comes to understand that they're going to have to at least pay some lip service to the demands of the more desperate people, the kinds of people who were raiding the Bastille, raiding that prison, and killing the guards. So they draft what is basically a promise. They call it the Declaration of Rights of Man and the Citizen, and it's based in a lot of ways on the American Declaration of Independence, but there are some differences. And in a lot of senses, this is basically a promise to everybody in France, particularly the more desperate members of France, that real political change will occur. They will be guaranteed rights, the rights that they so desperately crave. So, that Declaration of Rights of Man, which was written in 1789, does a couple of things. First and foremost, it abolishes the privileges or special treatment of that first and second estate. So really, from the publication of the Declaration of Rights of Man forward, the idea is there is no longer an estate system where certain people have certain rights and other people do not. As I said earlier, it's based to some degree on the American Declaration of Independence, which had come some years before. And in a nutshell here, it's essentially saying that all men have natural rights. And you notice it says all men have natural rights. This was not, in its own way, this was not an equal document, because men have rights to the exclusion of women. Women were still considered second-class citizens under the Declaration of Rights of Man. So again, this was a moderate kind of document. This was not a radical document. All male citizens will be equal under the law. There will be freedom of religion. For many years, the French government had sort of favored the Catholic Church, and that was not to be any longer. Now you would have freedom of religion. You'd be able to decide what form of God you want to worship. And then that last that last piece there that says promises to tax people based on what they can afford was what a lot of people were really looking for. So if you're extremely wealthy, the concept goes that you'll be taxed more because you can afford it. Unlike what had been going on before, where people who couldn't afford it were being asked to bear the tax burden for the entire nation. Really, the slogan of the French Revolution after the publication of the Declaration of Rights of Man and the Citizen becomes liberty, equality, and fraternity. Liberty meaning some degree of freedom. Equality being, really in this case, meaning no more estate system. And fraternity, meaning brotherhood. So again, there's that emphasis on the male citizen. It says fraternity, which means equality amongst men, which again, the French Revolution has been criticized, particularly the earlier part here, because it does not go nearly far enough for equal rights amongst the sexes. So, the Constitution of 1791, you could see it takes 2 years to write. The initial meeting of the National Assembly occurred in July of 1789, and by 1791, they had come out with a new framework of government for France. And it's based upon Enlightenment thinking, very much in line with what the Declaration of Rights of Man and the Citizen had said, that life, liberty, and property are important. And they really base the system of government on what the English had. So they do not get rid of Louis XVI during this time. They basically say he can stay as king, but he needs to govern in accordance with a representative assembly of elected people. So they limit his power. They do not take away his monarchy. He remains king. This whole concept of natural rights is very much built into the government, as it had been in the American system a couple of years before. You know, the American Constitution and the French Constitution of 1791 were created within a couple of years of each other, so there is definitely a lot of similarities between the two, especially when it comes to natural rights, and it being the government's job to protect those natural rights. So you could see here, from the unfortunate fellow who has his head being grasped by somebody here, that the revolution doesn't end in 1791. The problem really is that a lot of the more desperate people, the kind of people who had been responsible for the storming of the Bastille, many of them feel that it doesn't go far enough. First, particularly, when you look at some of the limitations, fraternity, meaning only men have power. So many women believed there needed to be further changes, but there was also some degree of anger that the king, Louis XVI, who had created so many of the problems for France, gets to remain in power. So the revolution is going to take a radical turn, and sometimes we refer to this phase of the French Revolution, really from 1791 to 1793 or so, as the radical phase. A lot of people didn't trust Louis XVI because he had been born as a divine right ruler. And as it turns out, that mistrust was probably correct, because what Louis does is he tries to enter into an alliance with France's enemies in order to return him to his total divine right power throne. In other words, what he does is he attempts to escape France. He was unhappy after a year or so of being a limited monarch. He tries to escape under cover of darkness and in a disguise so that he could return to France at the head of an army to try to undo the French Revolution. So they were correct to not trust him, because Louis really never was happy with the situation. When it comes to be that Louis tries to escape, it turns out he is captured. And when he's captured, it sort of demonstrates to a lot of people that this guy could never remain in power in France. So he's put on kind of a show trial. And what occurs is he is going to be beheaded. And the method of execution here, using the guillotine, this new invention, is going to be done in a very public way. People are going to gather around and watch the execution of Louis XVI. For ultimately, he's charged with treason. He's working against his own country. He does try to leave in order to come back to conquer France, in a sense. So he's charged with treason, and really throughout history, the penalty for treason has always been death. So he is executed. And upon his execution, certain radical thinkers, political thinkers, take control of the government. And they turn it into a republic. And a republic is a form of government where representatives are elected to govern for people. And in this republic, there would be no king. There would be no, in this form of government, there would be no king. So what we see here is a radicalization of the French Revolution, meaning they're moving further away from where they started. Initially, before the events of 1789, France had been an absolute divine right monarchy. After the Constitution of 1791, it becomes a form of limited monarchy. And now, with the execution of the king, it becomes a republic. So we're moving further and further away from what France had been prior to the revolution. King Louis XVI is executed, as would be his wife a little bit later, Marie Antoinette. And what this does, this public execution, or what's called regicide, the killing of a king or a queen, is going to get the attention of the other countries of Europe. Other countries like Prussia, that's with a P, Prussia, and Russia, that's with an R, and Spain, and even England. These are nations that, many of which, except for England, have absolute kings. So there's a great deal of worry. Remember, when France sneezes, the rest of Europe catches cold. There's a fear that if they allow France to simply get rid of their kings, maybe the kings of Prussia, Russia, and Spain will be next. So what's going to occur is they are going to invade France to try to undo the events of the French Revolution and reinstall some form of absolute monarch or absolute king on the throne. So, that being said, the likes of Spain and Prussia and Russia and other smaller principalities are really going to want to crush France's revolution, because it's seen as a liberal revolution, meaning wanting to change from things that have gone on before. Divine right monarchs in Europe were afraid that if France was successful, what happened there would happen in their own country. So they put together armies and they invade France. What happens next is France and the leaders of France are going to be forced to respond in some way to what Europe was doing. So they form a committee of public safety headed by an individual named Maximilien Robespierre. Robespierre was an Enlightenment thinker. He was an attorney. He was very well spoken, very eloquent. And he believed he had all the answers. So the idea here is going to be France is going to need to defend itself from its enemies. So it's kind of interesting because you see the irony here. Robespierre is going to be given broad or total legislative, executive, and judicial powers in order to defend France from those who want to destroy the revolution. Now, you know, if you're thinking here, you realize that the French Revolution was all about breaking up those legislative, executive, and judicial powers into different elected bodies. But the judgment is made here that, particularly by people like Robespierre, that in order to save the revolution, drastic steps would need to be taken. And one of those steps that would need to be taken was to make a very clear show of national unity. You were either with the revolutionaries or you were not. And this is the point, really, 1792, where you start seeing a tremendous amount of the guillotine being used to execute people who were suspected of not fully supporting the French Revolution and all that it stood for. So even though the Enlightenment, and again, here's the irony, even though the Enlightenment was supposed to be all about thinking and broadening debate and, you know, new ideas, the problem here is that the Enlightenment thinkers who were running the French Revolution began to believe that their way was the only way. And in an effort to defend France from its enemies, they began to do away with people who dared to think differently than they did. So you start seeing mass executions in the streets of Paris. Some people said that the streets of Paris ran red with blood from all of the beheadings that were occurring, because it became a sort of a state of paranoia. Some people, for simply having written a letter to somebody who used to be employed by King Louis XVI, they would be killed for fear of treason. Other people who wore their hair a certain way because they looked too noble might be killed because they didn't look common enough. and things of that nature. So it really did become a state of chaos after a while. So there it is. We refer to this period of the mass execution as the Reign of Terror, trying to save the French Revolution and the ideas that it stood for from the threat of invasion. And although it was a horrible time and many people lost their lives, the reality is they were sort of successful, because France on its own wound up expelling and defeating the combined armies of Europe. That's the armies of Spain, Russia, Prussia, Britain, everybody who invades France trying to destroy the revolution. The French, really through spirit, for dedication to what they believed they were defending, were able to defeat the combined armies of Europe. But the interesting thing is, when the threat of invasion passes, they tire of the violence. And this is where Mr. Robespierre is going to sort of get his. And you see, this is sort of the beginning of what we refer to as the third phase of the revolution, or the second moderate phase. We're going to get rid of the Committee of Public Safety when France is safe. We're going to install a government that is much more moderate and in line with sort of gradual change. And that's what's going to occur. So this moderate period that I'm referring to here is what we call the Directory. And it was really, it was a corrupt time, but you do see an end to the mass killing that had occurred in the previous years. And for 5 years, it's really a group of people who call themselves representatives running the government. And although order was restored to the country and some degree of stability occurs, it's seen as a body, this Directory, that could be bribed, that laws would be passed for what you want if you simply pay them money. So it becomes very unpopular and very sort of against the spirit of what the French Revolution was supposed to stand for in the first place. And it's at this point that you see a little general named Napoleon Bonaparte sort of make his first bids for political power. He had made his name in the previous years of war, being a brilliant general, brilliant soldier, and he's able to gain enough support where people support his overthrow of the Directory. He stages what's called a coup d'etat, or an overthrow of the state, that's going to bring the Directory period to an end. And initially, Napoleon's going to he's going to be a dictator, or refer to himself as a dictator, but shortly after he will wind up crowning himself emperor. Now, it's interesting because, like Robespierre, you're going to have an individual here. So, like I was saying, very similar to Robespierre here, you're going to have an individual who is going to claim to be defending the ideals, life, liberty, and property, equal civil rights, things like that, of the French Revolution, but he's going to be doing it in a way where he has total power. And if you're really thinking, you realize that that's an idea that is very much at odds with everything that the French Revolution stood for. He becomes a dictator, he becomes an emperor, but he truly in his soul, I think, believed that he was the only person who could adequately defend the French Revolution from those who would like to undo it. His background in the military, his belief that he understood what the revolution was really all about, he believed equipped him to, in a unique way, serve as a kind of rightly guided emperor, an emperor who would keep the best of the revolution in mind as he passed his laws. So, Napoleon, again, because many people had grown very tired of that Directory, that corrupt group of people who governed in the name of the revolution for 5 years, Napoleon is going to sort of see himself as the bringer of freedom. Sometimes I like to say that Napoleon was going to enslave people in order to make them free, in his own mind at least. So he's going to, during his time in power, invade places like Italy, Austria, and even Russia, in an attempt to free them from their absolute monarchs. He will stage these revolutions in these further countries to sort of export or bring the best of the French Revolution to places outside of France. His belief was the only way these ideals could survive was if they spread to foreign nations. So people supported Napoleon mostly because they understood he was a person who got things done, as most successful military generals are. They're able to make things happen. And that's what Napoleon is really able to do. They see him as a person who brings stability. Now remember, by 1799, the French Revolution in some way had been going on for 10 years, and people were tired of the upheaval. So they believed he would be the person to bring stability to France and stability to Europe. It's interesting because in some ways he does, and in other ways he really does not, in the idea that he's exporting war, exporting revolution to these other nations. That brings about a great deal of instability. But again, in Napoleon's mind, he believed he was bringing them gifts of freedom, gifts of ideology, the gift of governments that support notions of life, liberty, and property, unlike the kinds of governments that many of these countries had. Austria was an absolute monarchy, as was Russia, as was Prussia. And the thinking was that he was bringing them a system that was better than what they had. So by 1803, Napoleon is going to go ahead and crown himself emperor, and really the method by which he crowns himself is kind of interesting. Under European tradition, normally the person that could bestow an emperorship or a kingship on an individual would be the Catholic Pope, because the concept had always been that God bestows power. This is divine right. When the ceremony was taking place, Napoleon actually seized the crown out of the Pope's hands and placed it on his own head. And his message was very clear to people who were seeing. He was not accepting a divine right appointment. He was essentially crowning himself, which was very much in line with the kind of thinking that the Enlightenment represented, that human beings are capable of great things. Napoleon was basically saying that he was a self-made king. He was a human king. He would represent the interests of human beings. Again, a lot of this turns out to be more than other European kings can stand. War will break out. Napoleon will defeat all of the European powers. A lot of this has to do with his brilliance as a general. And really, just like what's going to happen, 140 years later in World War II, all of Europe is going to come under the control of one nation. In this case, it's Napoleon, except for England. Remember, England, the island nation to the north of France, sort of remained independent and remained free from Napoleon's rule during this time, mostly because of England's strong navy. The English Navy, the Royal Navy, had always maintained a sort of barrier between Britain and the rest of Europe, and they're going to use that navy to try to strangle France in a sense. They're going to stop everything, all materials, imports and exports, everything from going into or coming out of France. And with that occurring, the idea was the French would have to surrender. They would have to give up, because they would basically starve to death. Without being able to trade, without being able to import needed items, they would have to fold. That's the thinking. Napoleon will counter with this concept of the continental system, meaning he'll conquer every country that he can, and basically take the needed resources from them and not need to do overseas trade. As it turns out, this continental system that Napoleon tries, it's really not enough. France was too dependent on imports and exports from other places, and it's going to result in a naval showdown between the French Navy and the English Navy at Trafalgar, which the English are going to win. But in the meantime, Napoleon does create a major empire throughout Europe. He's going to use really a system of relative power here. He's going to put his cousins, he's going to put his nephews and people of that nature in power in places like Spain and Germany and Holland. And again, what this winds up doing is creating sort of a backlash. You know, even though Napoleon believed he was bringing freedom to these places, many of the people in places like Italy, Germany, Holland, and Spain, they're going to see this as enslavement. They don't want relatives of Napoleon in power in their nation. They want their own people in power in their own nation. So you hear I'm using the word nation quite a bit. This is going to wind up resulting in lots and lots of nationalism, pride in one's nation, pride in one's country, which is going to lead to a desire to overthrow Napoleon in these places. So Napoleon, during his 15 years or so in total power, does have a couple of achievements, and it's important to remember that Napoleon historically was not a monster. We're not talking about Adolf Hitler here. We're not talking about Joseph Stalin. I do believe that in his soul he believed he was doing the right thing for people, bringing them freedom, bringing them enlightenment. So you're going to see a number of achievements in the economic sphere, the building of new industry, roads and canals, which connects people to one another and allows trade to grow. Education, you know, this whole idea of a government-supervised public school system, kind of similar to what we have today, establishing certain standards for education, very important. And then this last idea here, the Napoleonic Code, which is a system of law that Napoleon believed would actually put a lot of the Enlightenment into action, particularly social equality, religious toleration, and jury trials. Basically, the right to be tried by a jury of your peers instead of some arbitrary ruler who could rule however they want. The idea that an unelected or a random jury would be fairer was kind of revolutionary. Now, there's a lot of stuff here on this slide, but I'll kind of break it down quickly here, because the reasons for Napoleon's eventual fall are kind of obvious. Right? I already referred to nationalism, right? People didn't want to be governed by the French. They wanted to be governed by themselves. So this is going to cause a major backlash and a resistance to Napoleon's rule. People in Austria, people in Germany, people in Italy are going to want to fight back, and ultimately that's what does occur. The invasion of Russia in 1812 was a major catastrophe for Napoleon and his armies. The Russians just keep retreating into the vastness of their nation and just wait for winter to occur, basically. And when it does, the French troops are going to freeze to death. Napoleon's also going to lose a lot of credibility when he leaves his army. Napoleon basically deserts his army and goes back to France in the middle of the winter, and that's gonna hurt him politically because they see him basically as a quitter, somebody who gave up. And really, the ultimate thing that brings Napoleon's eventual fall about is that alliance between the major European powers. Russia, Britain, Austria, Prussia, they're all going to basically gang up and eventually defeat Napoleon. And when they do, he'll be banished. He'll live the rest of his life in exile on an island, and it's not a very long life. It's a couple of years before he dies in exile. And then what basically happens by 1815 is Europe has to decide, after 25, 26 years of intermittent war, what direction it's going to go. Okay, so 1814, 1815, revolution had been going on for decades at this point, and the mess needed to be cleaned up. That's basically the idea here in this next section, the restoration of Europe. Political leaders, some of them, came to regard the events of the French Revolution and the wars that followed it as a gigantic mistake, something that should never have occurred and could never be allowed to occur again because of the chaos and the death and the destruction that it caused. And so for somebody living in 1814 or 1815 here, it looked like that was a pretty reasonable thought, that these Enlightenment ideals, these thinkers who believed they had all the answers, looked like they might be wrong because of the instability and the chaos that they seem to have caused. So some leaders are going to have some ideas about how Europe should be put back together, how the mess should be cleaned up, and how they could prevent another French Revolution from ever occurring. Now, there was a great deal of opinion as to how the restoration of Europe could be done. In the early 1800s, Europeans were divided into three main political groups about the path that countries should follow to fix things. Starting off on the left, radicals believed that revolutionary overthrow of the existing order was the best thing to do. Liberals tended to believe that moderate reforms, like giving the middle class a larger say in government, were an appropriate way to proceed. And conservatives opposed change. They felt that all change, any kind of change, caused social upheaval, and that's no good. And really here it's going to be the conservatives in 1815 who get their way. They're going to look at everything that the Enlightenment and the Revolution had created, and they're going to say, it just creates chaos, and it can't be allowed to occur again. So really, conservatives are going to be the group that are going to be successful in 1815. Now, after Napoleon's defeat, a lot of Europe's rulers are going to meet in a city called Vienna, which is in Austria, to react to the events of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. And the object of this meeting is to make Europe look the way it was before the Revolution, before 1789. They're going to try to recreate the past, which, if you think about it, that's what, in this sense, conservatives want. Conservatives fear change. People of the conservative order during this period fear anything that resembles liberal change, and that's ideas associated with the Enlightenment. So they're going to have a meeting in Vienna, and historians refer to this meeting as the Congress of Vienna. And in 1815, the Congress of Vienna's major task was to recreate Europe as it had been. That means the political boundaries of the countries as they had been roughly in 1789, and also recreate the kinds of governments that Europe had had in 1789, which really is a return to absolute monarchy, doing away with the ideas of the French Revolution and the Enlightenment. So what they do here is they're going to restore as many families and as many ruling families to power in each country as they can. So you're going to see, particularly in countries like Prussia and France, the families of rulers who had either been killed during the Napoleonic Wars or the rulers themselves, if they had survived, will return to the throne. You're going to see a return to absolute power here. And they're also going to try to create a system of balance. You see, a lot of people looked at what Napoleon had done as a result of France becoming too powerful in the middle of Europe. So they want to establish what they call a balance of power. This is a system where no single one country could ever become powerful enough to dominate the other countries. And the way that they're going to try to do this is by creating what they referred to as a holy alliance, an alliance of nations determined to cooperate in the event that one of the countries rebels against their monarch. So the idea here is that if there is a revolution in a country like Prussia or France again, the other countries that are part of the alliance would sort of swoop in and crush the revolution before it gets out of hand, as had happened in France. The problem with all of this, and the problem with the conservative way of thought here in 1815, was that the cat was already out of the bag, so to speak. Once you have people
get used to the idea of freedom and equality and Enlightenment thought, you can't simply just put it back in the bottle and forget about it. It had been ignited. The French Revolution had started something. So you're going to see this idea of liberal nationalism spread throughout Europe during the early part of the 1800s, despite what the people at the Congress of Vienna wanted. You're going to see that people, despite the fact that, governments are reestablished that espouse absolute monarchy and things like that, people aren't going to really buy into it. People, until they're ready to revolt, they'll pay lip service to these governments, but they're not going to really believe in it the way they did prior to the French Revolution. There's a belief that government does need to represent the will of the people. It does need to be sort of democratic. And there's a great deal of resentment against this attempt to sort of go back in time and recreate Europe as it had been. So this conservative order, the impact of the Congress of Vienna, will last a little while, a couple of decades, but eventually you'll see that you can't simply undo everything that the French Revolution had stood for once people become familiar with it. So here he is. This is Clemens von Metternich. He was sort of the chief statesman at that Congress of Vienna. He was like the ultimate conservative. It was really his ideas that sort of carried the day in Vienna. And what we refer to as the Metternich era are the years, the decades immediately following the Congress of Vienna in 1815. So you'll see throughout the 18 teens and the 1820s and 30s, there's going to be a real effort to stamp out liberal nationalist revolutions while they start to occur. Okay, the Metternich system, as it's referred to, was to prevent nationalism and liberal change in Europe. And for the time being, it's successful. There's going to be nationalist movements, revolutions that occur in places like Germany, Italy, and Poland, but that Holy Alliance will successfully kind of swoop in and prevent those revolutions from getting too out of hand. The first time there's a successful nationalist revolution after the events of the Congress of Vienna in 1815 is what you see happening in Greece and Belgium. They establish sort of nationalist governments, democratically oriented governments, even though the Holy Alliance was against it. So you see sort of cracks in the Metternich system occurring relatively early on. Even France, which was right in the middle of the whole agreement, is going to overthrow its own restored absolute monarchy, which occurs after 1815. And they're going to establish a new constitutional monarchy in 1830. So you'll see that the Metternich system, although it was intended to prevent this kind of thing, it really can't prevent it for very long. Because again, the cat's out of the bag. People want certain degrees of democracy and freedom, and Europe is changing during this time. So 1848 is a really important year. It's sort of thought of as the turning point of the 19th century. There's a wave of revolutions that occur throughout Europe. And for the most part, the Metternich system holds. Austria, the revolutions in Austria with Russian support resist the revolution. Many of them collapse. France goes through some political change here with the establishment of a dictatorship, so that republic that had been established in 1830 is overthrown. It's really a chaotic year here. You're going to see Napoleon's nephew, he refers to himself as Napoleon III, come into power here. But what it really, and all the nitty-gritty here, all the details aren't as important as the big idea with 1848. If you remember in 1848 that it proves that the ideas of the French Revolution aren't going to simply go away. You can't stamp out the past. You can't prevent the future from coming. And 1848 really proves that. It's even going to inspire people like Karl Marx and the changes that are occurring to write his Communist Manifesto, which we'll talk about later. But 1848 is a major, it's sort of seen as the last stand of the Metternich era, the last stand of the Holy Alliance. It's the last time that conservative order, trying to undo the events of the French Revolution, it's the last time they can sort of successfully prevent revolutions. The next time, in the 1860s and 70s, it's going to be impossible to prevent the changes that are going to occur. Now, just like you couldn't stop the changes of the French Revolution in Europe, a lot of those changes are going to go across the pond into Latin America as well. Enlightenment thought, the desire for democracy, the desire for freedom is going to be imported into Latin America. Those countries are also going to be inspired by the events of the American Revolution. So the two primary instigators for the changes that occur throughout the 1800s in Latin America really are the events of the American and the French Revolution. Now, if you look at this map, you see a lot of new countries are going to form throughout Latin America. Brazil, Bolivia, Peru, Colombia. There's many new countries that are going to form because they're going to declare their independence, just as the United States had done, from their colonial rulers, okay? And they're also going to try, at least at first, to adhere to democratic forms of government, although there's going to be reasons why in Latin America democracy and even nationalism are not going to be nearly as successful as they were in the United States in the prior century. So here it is, the revolutionary ideas spread to Latin America mostly because of the events of the American and French revolutions. Part of it has to do with what had happened while Europe was at war during Napoleon's time. France had been unable, and Spain had been unable to sort of govern their colonies effectively during the Napoleonic Wars. So the colonies had been left to fend for themselves for many years. And when they got used to that, it became very difficult for the nations to sort of reestablish control after the wars. So after Napoleon's defeat, Spain's going to try to reestablish their system, but Latin American leaders are going to refuse to return to Spanish rule, and they're going to demand independence. And this is going to be the start of a lot of different wars of independence for these nations. You know, there were many, many conflicts during this time. We're only going to look at a few of them here. Some of the ones that really changed the way things were here in the Western Hemisphere. You're looking at a picture there of Toussaint Louverture. He led an uprising in Haiti, basically rebelling against the French in 1791. And it's an interesting thing because they were inspired to a large degree by the events of the French Revolution, which were espousing freedom and democracy, yet they were still holding colonies in the New World. So to the Haitians, it looked extremely hypocritical. This was the first Latin American colony to be liberated from European rule. It's also the most successful slave revolt in world history here. It was a long, drawn-out war. Toussaint Louverture, the leader, who sort of fashioned a lot of his thinking and even modes of dress here on the way George Washington did. He's not going to live through the conflict. He's actually going to die in a French prison. But it establishes a trend that plays out throughout really the next 100 years in Latin America, that of the declarations of independence from European leaders. You see the same kinds of things happening in France. Miguel de Hidalgo led a failed rebellion against Spain in 1810, but then later subsequent revolutions would eventually liberate Mexico from Spain. And again, there were so many different wars and fights for independence here. We can just touch upon some of the more important leaders, like José de San Martin, worked to liberate Argentina and Chile from Spanish rule in the years 1816 to 1818, and Bolivar, Simon Bolivar. really, he was a major nationalist from Latin America. He liberated Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia. Initially, he had an idea for what he referred to as a Grand Colombia, which would have been sort of like a United States of South America. That never really panned out, but he was an important leader to get many of these Latin American nations out from under the colonial rule that they had been under. Now, while all this was going on, the first 20 years of the 1800s were extremely active in the creation of new countries in Latin America. The United States itself had a decision to make, right? Should they support the creation of these new countries to our south, or should we fight against them? And ultimately, it's going to be the Monroe administration that is going to issue a kind of doctrine or an announcement in 1823. And that announcement is going to come in support of these newly independent nations. And the reason behind it, this is actually pretty important, the reason behind it was that the United States, and it wasn't out of the goodness of our heart or anything like that, and it wasn't even as much, even though people like to equate it with, well, we fought against a colonial power, so we were supporting others who fought against colonial powers. And all of that sounds great, but it was really the sort of the idea of the Monroe administration, the President James Monroe, that it's better to have weak, disunited nations to our south than European-controlled nations to our south. And really, this is the first time the United States is going to try to flex some international muscle. The idea here is, and the big idea of the Monroe Doctrine is that the U.S. will oppose any attempt by European powers to establish new colonies in the Western Hemisphere. In a sense, we were saying that the Western Hemisphere is closed to European colonization. The era of European colonization in this part of the world is over henceforth, and any attempt to re-establish colonies would be met with American declarations of war against the nation that dares declare new colonies in this side of the world, the Western Hemisphere. It's really the first time the United States is announcing that we have a special interest. We are a special power in the Western Hemisphere, and we are going to look after our part of the world. In a way, it's almost saying like the U.S. is the power to be dealt with in this side of the world, while at the same time seeming to accept the creation of these new countries, even though, again, it wasn't out of kindness that we accepted these new countries being born. It was really out of what was deemed geopolitical necessity, meaning the country had to do it in order to look after our own best interests. Now, Latin America in the 19th century was not as successful in establishing democratic governments as we were here in the North. And the reason for that has a lot to do with the systems that they were coming from. Remember, the United States, the colonies of Britain, the 13 original colonies, came from a system of limited constitutional monarchy where there was a system of civil rights. The Latin American colonies were coming from monarchies that were absolute, particularly the Spanish colonies. They didn't have systems of democracy and rights. They had autocratic rule where dictatorship was likely to naturally develop. They had no experience with democracy. So right away, you're going to see few democratic governments successfully established in Latin America, sharp divisions between rich and poor, and really unstable governments, instability throughout the 1800s. And another reason why that doesn't change for some time was the economic dependence on Europe. Because land and the wealth that the land produced remained in the hands of a very small, privileged group of people, those groups of people remained very resistant to diversifying the economy, meaning keeping their countries dependent upon the export of cash crops, products like coffee and sugar, The fields that grew coffee and sugar were owned by these rich people who maintained the power in the country and who resisted opportunities for the country to develop different ways of making money. Because as long as they resisted those different ways of making money, they remained in control of all of the economic wealth in those countries. So those cash crops remained the primary way that money was made, and very few people controlled the way money was made in those countries. So as a result, those countries, again, countries like Colombia and Bolivia and Panama, many of these nations, they're going to remain dependent on Europe for manufactured goods. They're going to actually fight against individuals in these countries that want to begin manufacturing their own goods, because it was not in the rich people's best interest for that to happen, for anything to change. And then you have the role of the caudillos. Some of the Latin American countries come under the rule of these powerful military leaders or bosses. What essentially happens here is these leaders are able to play off some of the tensions in the country, exploiting divisions between those conservative landowners who wanted to continue ruling the nation through the money gained by the export of cash crops like coffee and sugar, and playing them off against some of these other liberal thinkers, people who wanted change more along the lines and an economy more like that of the United States. The old expression to divide and conquer. These caudillos are basically going to begin running these countries to some degree, because they will sort of play one side off against another. So what we have here, just to kind of sum up briefly, is the discussion of what occurred during the Scientific Revolution, the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, and then the spread of revolutionary ideas throughout Europe and Latin America. What began really as a group of intellectuals thinking about the natural world and then the political world sort of explodes during the second half of the 1700s into real political revolutions, where those ideas, Enlightenment ideas, are going to try to be put into use. There will be a conservative reaction against those ideas, like what you see with the Metternich era, and then an inability to control those ideas by the conservatives, which will result in the spread of more nationalism and more change, not only in Europe, but in Latin America as well. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to our next discussion.